I'm Judy Wilson, a member of the Author Selection Committee. The New York Times best-selling writer Hanff Korelitz will kick off our afternoon session. Her latest and 8th novel, The Latecomer, follows on the heels of her 2 blockbusters, The Plot and You Should Have Known Better, which became the HBO series The Undoing, starring Hugh Grant and Nicole Kidman. The Latecomer will also be adapted as a limited series. Jean was born and raised in New York City. After graduating from Dartmouth, she continued her education in the UK at Clare College, Cambridge. She's a big fan of book clubs. Jean is the founder of Book the Writer, a New York City-based service that offers pop-up book groups. Isn't that a great idea? She's married to the Irish poet Paul Muldoon, and they have 2 grown children. The Latecomer is the story of what it means to be a family. The Oppenheimer triplets, 2 boys and a girl, were born in the early days of in vitro technology. Raised on the Upper East Side of New York City, the triplets have a shallow, distracted mother, a disengaged father, and they really don't like each other very much. Korelitz offers the reader a tale of a complicated marriage, sibling rivalry, and an unexpected event that threatens the dynamics of the family. She also paints a vivid picture of New York City and Brooklyn, giving the novel a great sense of place. The characters are rich and fully fleshed out. Their various fates coil around each other in unexpected twists and turns. The novel is wickedly clever, urbane, nuanced, and funny. The New York Times called The Latecomer a Gilded Age novel for the 21st century. And indeed it is. Please help me welcome Hanff Korelitz.
Thank you, Judy. I feel I need to start off by saying something about rats. Thank you, Karen. I moved 2 months ago, more or less from one end of Manhattan to the other. I now live in South Street Seaport, a neighborhood of the city that I had never set foot in, maybe a school trip when I was a kid, before I moved there. But I knew that the neighborhood had been home to a huge colony of rats because my friend Robert Sullivan wrote an incredible book some years ago called Rats, which some of you may be familiar with. It is famous for 2 reasons. First, it's famous for its cover, which is extremely well known among graphic designers. It's a great, great book cover. It has Manhattan Island in the shape of a rat, or vice versa, depending on. I'm sure, Karen, did you read Rats? I don't know where you are. Okay. Well, it's an amazing book, but the other reason it's famous is that Robert Sullivan spent a year standing out in an alley in South Street Seaport watching a colony of rats and using his nighttime observations to write about rats are New York history, and New York history is rats. So I ran into Bob a couple of weeks ago, and I said, we're living downtown now, and I want to know where was the alley. And we got out my phone and we expanded and expanded and expanded the map. And he said, that's it. It was an alley that just, you had to really expand it to make it pop up. But I knew exactly where it was because I go past it every day to go to the subway. And he was also able to tell me that our new home is across the street from the home of the Rat King, who ran all the rat fights in my new neighborhood of Manhattan. So that is my rat story. And I challenge Tess to come up with an even better rat anecdote when it's your turn. You got to really round it off here and talk about rats. Okay, so before The Undoing appeared on HBO in the fall of 2020, there were probably about 8 people who were aware of my work as a novelist, or who had read any of the 6 novels I published up to that point, including You Should Have Known, which was the basis for The Undoing in the first place. Most of those 8 people were related to me, or had gone to camp or maybe college with me. And one was my long-suffering agent, who believed all evidence to the contrary that I would one day break through as a novelist if I could only get out of my own way. What was holding me back? a few things, some of them honestly beyond my control, like the fact that 2.3 million books are published every year. And that statistic is from 2019. And it doesn't even include the 1.7 million self-published books that same year. So math has never been my strong suit, you will be shocked to hear. But I am very comfortable in calling 2.3 commercially published books a lot of books. And remember, and I consider this a good thing, that over the past few years, it has become just as easy to locate and purchase a not brand new book like Madame Bovary, or the book from last year that everybody was talking about, as it is to find the book that's currently on the New York Times bestseller list or on the front table at Barnes & Noble. And as I said, that's a good thing, but it does mean that your new novel isn't just competing for the reader's attention with the other new novels, it's competing with every book, including Madame Bovary. So I've had the experience of walking into a bookstore and finding my new novel on the new novel shelf alongside hundreds of other new novels, and remember that each of those new novels also got written, also found an agent, also got sold to a commercial publisher. In other words, thousands of books grabbed every one of those brass rings my own books had managed to grab. And here they were, next to my new book, on the new bookshelf, and my heart would sink looking at all those new books, because I knew, a lot of them were probably really, really great. And also that in a few weeks, all those new books, including mine, were going to be replaced by hundreds of other brass ring grabbing, even newer new books. And many of them would also be great. So it's just absurdly unlikely that your little book was going to be the one that manages to emerge from all those high-achieving books and actually get read. So that was the part of the problem that was really beyond my control. The part that was not beyond my control, and which I do take responsibility for, had to do with genre, which has already come up today. And before I get all defensive about genre and how it has less to do with the books themselves than with where those books get shelved in the bookstore, thank you again, Karen, for making that point. I want to acknowledge that my inability to pick a genre and stick to it was greatly frustrating to the people attempting to publish me. For example, at the very beginning of my life as a novelist, by which I mean the never-to-be-published novels that I wrote in the 1980s and 90s, I was writing very literary fiction. I'd spent years before that writing poetry, before I was brave enough to attempt fiction, and those two unpublished novels might have been poems with all the lines run together. In any case, they were notably short on plot. And when 50 or so, let's just round it off at 50, it was probably more than that, rejections later, I finally got the message that I was not going to become a published novelist with those two novels. I did a whiplash pivot and wrote a legal thriller called A Jury of Her Peers, which found a publisher. Fantastic. But when that publisher asked me to write a sequel with the same protagonist, I had visions of A is for Alibi, and I knew that was not what I wanted. So I whiplash pivoted again. My second novel, The Saboté River, did feature a murder, or maybe two, and a trial, but it was also a literary novel, and my editor did not want to publish. She did not want to go in that direction with me, so I lost that publisher. Eventually, The Saboté River was picked up by a very literary publisher, which was amazing, but they hated the book I wrote next, so, and so on and so forth. The book I wrote next was frankly a little too weird for them. This was my third novel, The White Rose, which was based on the opera Der Rosenkavalier. I don't know if any of you are opera people. The White Rose got me called perverse in a review by Edmund White. I don't know if any of you know who Edmund White is. He's our greatest living gay novelist, and to be called a perverse by him is just amazing. Because I am such a prude. I'm a huge self-proclaimed prude, and if you think I'm being coy with that word, just ask my girlfriends. They'll tell you. But when my agent and I went out to find a publisher for The White Rose, I made another mistake. I allowed myself to have my head turned by a guy named Harvey Weinstein. I know, not that way, thank goodness. He had just set up a publishing wing of his Miramax empire, and the zeal with which he went after the White Rose meant only one thing to me, that Miramax wanted to make a fabulous Miramax film out of my literary novel, which was about a love triangle among Jewish intellectuals in New York City. And soon I would be at the Oscars, sitting between Gwyneth Paltrow and Quentin Tarantino at the after party. Needless to say, that did not happen. The White Rose got my usual 8 readers, and I never went to the Oscars. And Miramax Books folded the following year. Back to square one. Though, just as an aside, I would like to say that over the years, my heart has been warmed by the select group of readers who somehow discovered and loved The White Rose. I know we're not supposed to have favorite children, but if I did have one, it would be this novel. It is unautobiographical as everything I've ever written, but it is deeply personal to me. And I'm very happy to say it was later reissued in paperback, and I'm thrilled that it's here. It's out there on the table. Amazing. Then I lucked out, and I sold my next novel to someone I'd actually turned down for Harvey Weinstein. Her name is Deb Futter, and she was then the editor-in-chief at Grand Central Books. And though I would love to be able to say that all my troubles thus were ended, it was not to be. The next 3 books, Admission, You Should Have Known, and The Devil and Webster, continued to ricochet between genres and were variously called literary, thriller, mystery, and even something new called marriage thriller, which I think came out of England. I don't know what it is. All 3 were whatever the opposite of widely read is. And poor Deb had to go cap in hand to her bosses again and again for permission to keep publishing me. Okay, so I'm aware of how whiny this sounds, and I apologize. Failure, which has also come up today, is part of a writer's life, and I would go so far as to say that if you're not willing to fail, you should probably consider another field, maybe one where everyone gets a participant trophy. Those writers who sally forth with their first books into the Elysian fields of literary and bestseller success, and then follow that up with years of equally respected and successful books, are so rare that I bet you and I can come up with only a few names and probably the same names. In fact, throughout all the years I was writing and publishing the novels that only 8 people read, I knew what an enormous deal it was that my agent and my eventual editor continued to represent and publish me, despite the fact that my novels did so poorly. Then, 6 novels into my meandering career, I was orphaned, a common publishing experience in which the editor who purchased your book leaves the company before your book is published, whereupon your precious literary child is treated like Oliver Twist and cast among strangers, or in this case, handed off to a new editor who hasn't had a chance to read your book, but totally will get to it as soon as she can. So The Devil and Webster got 6 readers instead of 8, though again, my mother would like you to know that The Devil and Webster was a really bad title, and that didn't help. So now we come to the crux of the matter, because even though by this time I'd spent years ricocheting back and forth across the thriller literary divide, I was about to get a final genre designation, whether I'd earned it or not. One day the phone rang, and David E. Kelley bought the rights to You Should Have Known, whose characters and situations he loved, but which he proposed to take in a new direction. I've been a fan of David E. Kelley as far back as L.A. Law, and I would have agreed to any direction he wanted to go. Harry Hamlin crashing a wedding in a gorilla suit. We remember that? Yeah. Ally McBeal dancing with a huge animatronic baby. Yeah. The Big Sur real estate in Big Little Lies. It was kind of a no-brainer, even if it meant, which it did, that the characters in The Undoing were somehow no longer Jewish. And I myself had no idea who committed the murder until I watched the final episode along with everyone else. But when Kelley bought my novel, it was still 2019, and I was still a midlist novelist and an orphaned one to boot, whose last book had sold 6 copies. But at least I had an HBO show in the works with Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant, so it was something, right? And also, I was well into a new novel that, like You Should Have Known, featured an adulterous marriage, traumatized children, and a posh New York City private school. You might think that sounds familiar, but in fact, I had pivoted again. This new novel, which I was calling The Latecomer, was long, literary, and had 6 protagonists and not a single murder. Also, it was the most ambitious thing I'd ever taken on. Also, it was not going well. Was I nervous about how this book would be received? Yes. Sure, it was possible that Hugh Grant and Nicole Kidman were about to finally find me some readers, but by this point, I knew publishing a little too well to assume that even HBO guaranteed the sale of my next novel, especially this novel. And sure enough, when I presented an early draft of The Latecomer to my publisher, they rejected it. The editorial verdict that reached me via my agent, not even close. So, next, I sent my draft to my editor, now at her new imprint, Sell It on Books. Surely she would see what I was trying to do with the novel, and she did, better than I did at that moment, but she rejected it too. She said, "It's going to be fantastic, and I'm going to publish the hell out of it, but you need to write it again," and no contract until I did. I suppose we can call this tough love. Maybe we should call it the reason we have editors. I spent the fall of 2019 rewriting that novel only to submit it again in January of 2020 and have her reject it again. "It's going to be fantastic," she said, "and I'm going to publish the hell out of it, but you need to write it again. So perhaps you remember January of 2020? I do. It came after months of news reports out of China about a worrying new virus, and I've always been a person who takes that kind of thing seriously. By January of 2020, I strongly believed that we were all living in the opening chapters of Stephen King's The Stand. In short, the me who met with my editor in her office to discuss that second rejection was a me who was not a happy camper. Perhaps that's why, in the middle of that meeting, I suddenly heard myself telling her about a completely different story idea, about a failed writer who encounters a brilliant plot, which is not, strictly speaking, his brilliant plot. And he writes it himself once the original owner dies. Mayhem ensues. The next day, my editor shocked me by buying both novels, the barely formed one and the one she'd rejected the day before. When the pandemic arrived, a month later, I wrote the plot in 4 months, mainly cowering in my bed in fear and rage beneath the covers. Then I returned to my tough love manuscript, and for the first time, I understood what was wrong and how to fix it. So I fixed it. Actually, I did more than that. I wrote the novel I had set out to write. Big, complex, literary, but still full of the plot twists I've come to love. And my editor did pronounce it at last finished, and she did publish the hell out of it. I know that the novel's title, The Latecomer, which had nothing to do with its long gestation, is now satisfyingly meta. It took its sweet time getting here, just as I've taken my sweet time in getting to the novel I'm supposedly here to discuss. But I'm sure there's some platitude about the journey being more important than the destination or something like that. The Latecomer is about a wealthy New York family, the Oppenheimers, whose very foundational event is kept secret from the children because of their father's deep shame and their mother's misplaced accommodation. Descended from an all-too-real 18th century Jewish martyr, Joseph Oppenheimer, who was re-victimized in the 1930s by Goebbels' infamous propaganda film, Yud Zeus, the Oppenheimers have an unusual configuration in that there is a set of triplets, as Judy told you, and then many years later, just as those 3 are about to leave home, a 4th baby. And not just any baby, but actually a leftover embryo from the triplets' in vitro creation. What must have happened in this family for the parents to make such an unfathomable decision? Why did the triplets loathe one another so much? What has compelled the father to assemble a secret collection of world-class modern art and the entire life's work of a single outsider artist in a warehouse in Brooklyn. And what is life going to be like for this latecomer when she understands how broken her family is and how left behind she's been? It's a vast oversimplification to say that the latecomer is about a family, but then again, Anna Karenina, Brideshead Revisited, The Sound and the Fury, Pride and Prejudice, Booth, The Family Chow, and I just heard Tara Stringfellow, my fellow former poet, although I'm former, she's not, her novel Memphis, all about a family because, and probably many, many other books that we in this room could name, because family is the gift that keeps on giving for novelists. In the case of the Oppenheimers, I was attracted to the idea of a shattered family and the late child who is actually the key to that family and who takes it upon herself to solve its mysteries before she herself leaves home. This is a big novel into which I poured many of my own fairly disparate interests. It encompasses Jewish history and Mormon visionaries, artists, both traditional and so-called outsider, right-wing ideologues and documentary filmmakers, ethnic transgressors, progressive education, antiques dealers, and of course, hoarders. I've been told by people who know me that reading The Latecomer is like taking a self-guided tour of my brain, which is, a very odd thing to hear about a novel that, like all of my fiction, is far from autobiographical. But I have to agree. In the end, even to my own surprise, it all comes together. That's how I knew after all those drafts, after not even close, after you have to write it again, after having to put it down completely and write a totally different novel before I could see it clearly that I had finally gotten it right. I wanted The Latecomer to be, like most of the books I myself have loved, greater than the sum of its parts, and I'm the first to admit that there are a lot of parts. In fact, the novel at the back of my mind as I wrote this was John Irving's The World According to Garp, a book that might also be described as about a family. Those of us who read that novel, and I'm sure many of us did, will remember the many, many things that book was crammed with. Bears on unicycles, Viennese prostitutes, transgendered football players, feminist martyrs, wrestling, sexual assault, prep schools. The whole world was in that novel. But somehow it all came together in a joyful, tragic, silly, and redemptive whole. And what we all remember about it was its sweetness. The Latecomer has, I hope, a little bit of that whimsy and some of that heart. Yes, it took me ages to get there, but feeling it come together in its final drafts at last was one of the most satisfying experiences of my life as a novelist. I hope readers will look past what isn't there, crimes and trials and smoking guns, for example, and meet the Oppenheimers with an open mind. Thank you.
So literary fiction tends to be character-driven, and The Latecomer is both character-driven and plot-driven. So do you start with plot or characters, or how does that evolve?
I wish you'd all been there to hear Tara Stringfellow's beautiful speech in the breakout session, but she actually addressed this perfectly. She said, you don't know these people at the beginning. They come to you eventually. And wait, I've heard four novelists this morning. I may be wrong in who said that, but somebody said it this morning that, the hardest part of writing a novel is the very beginning because you don't know these people. You're writing them, you don't know what they look like, what they sound like, you don't know why they're important enough to be in your novel, but you just keep writing them and then gradually you get to know them. So I am of that school. One of the scariest things about beginning a book is all the not knowing. But if you just kind of have faith and keep at it, gradually these people come to you.
Thank you. What prompted you to write about siblings who had never bonded, especially triplets whom we all assume, erroneously, are very close?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I keep hearing from people who are almost offended that the siblings in this book really hate one another. But do we not all know families where the siblings hate one another? Why should it be more surprising in fiction than it is in real life? That's something that I keep trying to figure out. The most asked question I get is why these siblings hate one another. And I said in some interview somewhere, look, if you don't know after 450 pages, that's on me. I've failed if you don't know after 450 pages. But if you really don't know, write to me through my website and I will explain it. And I didn't think I'd hear from anybody, but I started hearing from a lot of people. So finally I had to write out the answers so I could cut and paste it into emails. But it's a more writerly response than I think people reading with a practical mindset will be happy with, but it is my response. So I won't offer it to you now because I'm sure that everybody in this room, once they read the book, will know the answer. But if not, ask me, I'll tell you.
So your description of Walden School skewers the so-called liberal elite private schools in New York. It was one of the aspects of the story that I particularly enjoyed. Was this based on personal experience, observation, or research?
I am a product of a progressive New York City private school. What's so interesting is the Reardon School, and you should have known, was very, very different from the way it was portrayed in The Undoing. And that school also was portrayed as a kind of a progressive school trying to find its way. They made it more like a young capitalist, and anyway, I'm not going to talk about The Undoing, but I'm an equal opportunity mocker. I mean, I mock the right and I mock the left. One of my favorite things is when people tell me that they don't know what my politics are from my books, because I'm kind of mean to everybody. After he read my novel, The Devil in Webster, I got an email from George Will telling me how much he liked it. And he said in the email, I don't know if you're going to be happy to hear from me. And I was like, George Will, what I would give for an entire Congress of George Will right now. But I love that even George Will couldn't tell what my politics were. Sorry, did that answer your question? Yes. All I will say is progressive education can be very, very silly. And there's an incident in the novel, if anybody has read the novel already, there's an incident involving a watermelon that is discussed. This is a real incident that took place at my alma mater a few years ago and was so absurdly ridiculous that I am not even the first faculty parent to put it in a novel. David Duchovny, whose daughter was in my son's class, put it in one of his novels. And I mean, sometimes a gift just falls in your lap and you're like, no, I have to write about that. So.
Great, thank you. So it seems most writers today don't give headings or titles to their chapters. You did, and I loved it.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to name the chapters?
Oh my God, it was so fun. But there were other reasons apart from it being fun. So every chapter in The Undoing has a title, but it also has a subtitle. A long time ago, I spent about a nanosecond in academia. I was never going to stay longer than that. But my field of interest was 18th century fiction. And in the early period of the novel, this was a very common thing to have this kind of subtitle, in which Gulliver wakes up on a beach, that kind of thing. So I did it for fun. I did it, but I did it also because this novel has 6 protagonists, and it was a way of saying to the reader, okay, now we're going back to this character, now we're going back to this character, and to give them a little teaser of what was in the chapter. I had and I think this might have been one of the problems I was having with the novel. I had a great fear that certain characters would be more interesting than others, and I didn't want people to sort of get to another Lewin chapter or Sally chapter or Harrison chapter and think, oh, I don't like this guy, this is going to be boring. So it was a way to say, get ready, we're going back to this character now.
It worked as a guide to the reader.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of characters need a little help.
In The Latecomer, both the Upper East Side of Manhattan and a developing Brooklyn are important places in this story. You live in New York. How do you create such a strong sense of place in a novel?
Thank you for suggesting that I have. I mean, this is a wonderful thing to hear. I don't always think of myself as somebody who's particularly good at that. I have set novels in places where I have lived, but also in places where I have not lived. And I don't know, I mean, New York is an effortless place for me to write about because I know it so well, even though I did spend 25 years in Princeton, New Jersey, so I did my time in New Jersey. Did my time in the suburbs.
Let me see. You answered quite a few of the questions I had. Could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned the pandemic and writing in that, and you got the novel done in 4 months. So did you feel the pandemic had a negative or positive effect? How did that work with your writing?
I was so full of rage that I wasn't having rational thought about anything at all. I mean, it did not help that I apparently was one of, I don't know, 50 people in the world who thought this was coming. Me because I'm paranoid. Other people probably because they were biologists or virologists. Years ago I read Laurie Garrett's book, The Coming Plague, and if you're historically minded, like if you're the kind of person who stands out in an alley and looks at rats and uses the rats to write about history, you know that rats in New York are not new. You know that pandemics are not new. There is no reason not to believe that this could happen today. Maybe we can slow it down. Maybe we can come up with a vaccine in record time, but we can't prevent it from happening. And I couldn't understand how people weren't as scared as I was. But when it happened, I was still scared, but I was scared in a different way. I was no longer scared that I couldn't stop it from happening. like I'm the Cassandra running around saying, it's coming, do something. I was just furious. I was furious at our government for their appalling mismanagement. And then I was angry at people who didn't get vaccinated. I was angry at a lot of people. But in terms of what I was able to do with that time, my husband and I went up to upstate New York where we have a house. He had a project. He was working on a book called The Lyrics with Paul McCartney. So he was downstairs Zooming with Paul McCartney, and I was upstairs under the covers writing the plot. And that's how we went on for months. And he brought me coffee in the morning. He brought me a drink in the evening, and then we watched The Sopranos. And that was, but that was kind of as big of I couldn't watch the news. I couldn't read the paper. All I cared about was that my elderly parents had not opened the door to anyone, and my kids were okay, and everything else just went pouring into this book. I'm sure, people were doing way more good for the world in those 4 months than I was. I am certainly making no claims about my altruism or my effectiveness in battling this thing, but I got a lot done.
Thank you. And Lyrics is really big.
Yeah, it was,
Really big book.
It was a little book, yeah.
Let's see. Oh, yes, you mentioned contemporary art, which is in your book. Mm-hmm. Do you have a particular interest in it, or did it just come through the novel?
It's actually one of the very few subjects in this book that I'm not particularly interested in. I happen to know Steve Martin, name drop, and this is all in the acknowledgments, so I'm not dropping it on you, but we went out to lunch together, and I said, here's the situation. There's this man with all the money in the world, and he's buying painters in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and he's not buying them for investment. He's not buying them with the idea of passing them on to anybody. He is buying them solely for the purpose of the way these particular paintings make him feel. And but by the year 2018, every single one of these paintings has to be fabulously valuable. And he just loved it. This was a whole kind of thought challenge for him. And with his help, we created this private museum.
Great. What about, you already told us what your favorite book is of yours, The White Rose. So we're all going to buy The White Rose before we leave here today.
I love them all, but, nobody read The White Rose. And, it was special because I wrote it right after 9/11, and it was full of my love for the city and my kind of wish to go back in time to a time before that had happened.
And one more question. Do you have a book you would recommend from another author for our audience to read?
Well, Judy mentioned Book the Writer, so a lot of the reading that I do is to prepare for these events. And right now, I'm reading the January 6th report because on March 21st, Eric Swalwell, the Congressman Eric Swalwell, is coming to do one of these events in New York to discuss the January 6th report. So I'm like, it's this big, and I'm like that far into it. But I will say that I just listened to Booth. I've been at an artist colony. Somebody mentioned Ragdale before for 10 days. And I would go for these long walks in the Prairie Reserve in the afternoons listening to Booth. And it was absolutely spectacular. So
Thank you for that. Thank you so much.